Good morning. This week we're going to meet someone new. Her name is Deborah. God's people had been captured by an enemy. They prayed to God, "Please help us get our land and freedom back." God listened and sent a woman named Deborah to help them. Deborah was a judge and was very wise and faithful to God. She gave people messages from God and helped people talk out their arguments. Every day, Deborah sat under a palm tree. Men and women who had problems came to her for help. One day, God gave Deborah an important message, a message that would help free the people of Israel. Deborah gave God's message to a man named Barak. She told him, God said, "Take 10,000 men and go to Mount Tabor. God will help you defeat the king's army and the Israelites will be free." Barak said, "I'll do this, but I need your help." Deborah, who was as brave as she was wise, agreed to go. She knew that God would be with her every step along the way. Barak and Deborah took 10,000 men to Mount Tabor. There was an awful battle. Yelling and fighting went on. The noise was loud and terrible. But God was always with Deborah and the Israelites, protecting them and keeping them safe. It was a hard fight, but finally Barak and the Israelites won. God helped them defeat the king's army, and there was peace for 40 years. Okay, now our question for you for this week. How do you think Deborah felt when she got the message from God to give to other people? Have you ever had messages that you had to share? We'll see you next week. Have a great week.
Hi, hope you guys had a great week. Nice and chilly at my house. Is it cold at your house? So exciting, and the leaves are changing. Great time of year. Well, you've heard the Bible story, and I have to share with you guys, sometimes when I'm listening to the Bible story, it gets hard to focus for me. In Bible times, it was super important to talk about family, like whose father was who and where they lived. And some of the names they used in Bible times, we don't use anymore. And some of the places aren't familiar to us. So I don't know about you, but I pay attention in the beginning, and then I get a little lost. Does that ever happen to you guys? Well, that happened to me a little bit with this story, but let's figure out what the Bible story is telling us. The one thing we have to remember, God has a plan. God always has a plan. Now, sometimes, have you ever planned things to happen, maybe play outside or do a game or do something, and it doesn't work out the way you wanted? That happens a lot to me too. And sometimes we have an idea how things should work, but maybe it's not along God's plan. So sometimes it just doesn't work right. And God also uses people to help with his plan. Sometimes the people that God's put around you in your life are there to help you. So let's go ahead and jump into this story. Now, what I found interesting is back then, men were in charge of the family and seemed to have a lot of roles in the Bible. This story, it's two women. One is named Deborah and one is named Jael. So let's go ahead and jump into the story. So, God's people are the Israelites. Guess what they are again? Did you pick up on that? They're slaves again. But they're not slaves in Egypt to Pharaoh. They had moved from when they left. They actually were living in an area called Canaan. So they became slaves to the king of the Canaanites. Do you know why? Did you catch why they became slaves? Well, their leader had passed. And when they lost their leader, they started to make bad choices. And God's punishment was he sold them into slavery to the Canaanites, to the Canaanite king. And they were slaves for 20 years. That's a long time. And they started calling out to God again for help. Do you think he heard them? He did. He heard them. But just because they wanted to be saved then, that may not have been part of God's plan, right? Let's find out what happened. So they had a leader. The Israelites had a leader at that point while they were slaves. Her name was Deborah. And do you know what she did as the leader, even though they were slaves? Well, people still had disagreements and arguments. So she, at a certain place, and the Bible story tells us where this location was, people that were arguing would come to her, and she would settle their disputes. She was a judge. And she was also a prophet, which means God spoke with her and used her. So God heard the Israelites and their suffering, and he had a plan to free them. But it took some time, and it took people. So, the king of the Canaanites had an army, and the captain or the commander of the army was named Sisera. And the Bible tells us he was very cruel, and he was also very well armed. And what they had back then, if you remember, in Egypt, we heard about like Pharaoh, when they came, they were riding on chariots. So it's like horse-drawn carriages, but very small carriages, and they used them for battle. So Sisera, remember, he's in charge of the army. He has 900 chariots. And they're not just wooden chariots. They're covered with metal, with iron. So they're pretty dangerous. Think about them as tanks. So Sisera had 900 tanks, and he probably used those to control the Israelites. So an Israelite man named Barak was part of the plan. So Deborah, the leader, met with Barak and told Barak the plan. God's plan was for Barak to take 10,000 Israelites and go to a location called Mount Tabor. And Deborah was going to make sure Sisera heard about this, kind of like a rebellion of 10,000 Israelite men that Sisera would need to put down with the chariots. So Sisera would take the army and take care of what he thought was a problem. And then, while Deborah was telling Barak this plan, she told him the name of the river that it would happen near, so they knew the location. And so Deborah was going to lure Sisera and the army there and give Sisera into Barak's hands. That's what God said, that God would allow the army to come into Barak's hands, so Barak would control what happened to the army. Now, do you think that worked exactly that way? Barak was scared. He didn't quite trust the plan. So he said to Deborah, "If you go, I will go. But if you don't, I won't." So Barak thought that Deborah had to be there to make the plan work. And maybe he also was kind of scared to think of the army and the 900 chariots coming at him, and magically he'd stop them. Maybe he was scared. So God's plan changed. God still used Barak, but Barak didn't get to control the outcome. Instead, that's what I wanted. Do you ever have that where you take notes and you're like, I need this? So the note is, Barak was still used, but Sisera, the commander, was handed over to someone else. Someone else became kind of the hero to get rid of the army captain. So here comes the action. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. So it all happened just like Deborah told Barak. Barak took 10,000 Israelites and headed to Mount Tabor. Deborah was able to let the army captain or the the army captain or commander, Sisera, know what was happening. And Sisera and all 900 chariots took off. And Barak and his men met Sisera right next to the river, just like Deborah said was going to happen. And you know what God did? The Bible tells us God took care of Sisera's army. He rooted. I think I'm saying that right. Rooted. Your parents probably will know that. The army by the sword. God did the battle. And when I looked up this word to know what rooted means, because we don't use it that often, it means defeated, caused to retreat, caused disorder. So guess what happened? God was there. God took care of the problem of the army, of all the chariots. And guess what? Sisera was fleeing on foot. He wasn't in his chariot anymore. He was running away. God did that. God has power. So, you want to hear what happens with Sisera? Okay, so he's running. He comes to a camp where there's tents. He hides in one of the tents. He knows that the people of this camp are friendly towards him. Well, when he gets into the tent, he's not by himself. There's a woman in there. Jael is in there. You know what he tells her? I'm going to hide here. If Barak and the others come by, tell them I'm not here and I'm thirsty. So she actually, instead of getting him water, she got him milk. He felt safe enough that he could hide there, that he fell asleep. Well, God had a different plan for him. God used Jael to kill him. And then when Barak came by the tent, Jael said, he's in here, and he's dead. So, Deborah and Jael became the heroes, and Barak helped. Remember, Barak was scared and didn't trust God's plan. So, Barak didn't get to free the Israelites from Sisera. Instead, Jael was able to do that final step. But you know who the major player in all of this was? Who do you think? God. It was God's plan. And when God took 10,000 Israelites versus 40,000 of the Canaanite soldiers, so must have been so scary, God defeated the Canaanites. God helped the Israelites. So we know that day that God subdued, calmed the Canaanite king, and the Israelites grew stronger. So God had a plan, and even though Barak said he wouldn't help exactly the way God had hoped, God didn't punish him. God used someone else. Now, that was the chapter 4. Now, chapter 5, which is interesting, was a song. It was a song praising God and his power, because that's what they did back then. They didn't have the written word. Was there TV? Was there computers? The way you heard things was through stories and oral traditions, and one of the ways we praise God is singing. So this is a beautiful song that tells the story, so everyone that heard it would understand what Deborah and Jael and how strong they were, and how Barak helped, and ultimately how God was for the Israelites and helped the Israelites. So I have to admit to you, the first time I read chapter 5, verses 1 through 31, I didn't quite get it. But after studying chapter 4, I do, and it's a beautiful song, if you can imagine it sung. And just the words are just lovely, and they tell what happened. So everyone that heard it would know how great God is and how God will always help us. Sometimes it's not when we think we need it, but He will never forget us. God is with you, and God puts people in your life and in my life to help us. He loves us. So I think we're going to end there today. And remember, back then, the Old Testament, unfortunately, there was a lot of war and a lot of battles and a lot of violence. But God loves us. Got to remember that. Can you pray with me? Okay, get comfy. All right. God, thank you for this week. Thank you for bringing us back together. Thank you for the Bible. Thank you for all the stories that we learn from it. And thank you for helping us understand more and helping us understand that you have a plan and you love us and you use people to help us. Please keep us safe this week and we'll see you next week. Bye. Bye. Amen.